Every day, thousands of people walked past him. Some looked away. Some pretended not to see him. A few would drop $1 in his cup without making eye contact, as if acknowledging his humanity might somehow contaminate them. He sat on the same corner in downtown Seattle for 3 years, a homeless veteran with a worn cardboard sign that said, "Please help. Vietnam vet. God bless." His name was James Morrison, though most people never bothered to ask. To them, he was just another face in the growing crowd of forgotten people living on the streets. But on a cold November morning, when James collapsed on that sidewalk and paramedics rushed him to Harborview Medical Center, something extraordinary happened. The doctor who came to treat him stopped dead in his tracks, his clipboard clattering to the floor. Because 37 years ago, in a jungle in Vietnam, this homeless man had saved that doctor's life. And what happened next would remind an entire city that the people we ignore, the lives we dismiss as worthless, might be the very heroes we owe everything to. Let's go back to 1971. James Morrison was 19 years old, fresh out of basic training, scared out of his mind, and on his second week in Vietnam. He was a rifleman with the 1st Cavalry Division, assigned to a platoon that was moving through dense jungle near the Cambodian border. The heat was suffocating. The fear was constant. Every tree could hide an enemy. Every sound could mean death. James had seen 3 men in his unit die in the 10 days he'd been in country, and he'd learned fast that the life expectancy of a new soldier in Vietnam was measured in weeks, not years. In that same platoon was a combat medic named Chen. Rob was 22, 3 years older than James, and he'd been in Vietnam for 7 months. 7 months of patching up wounded men, watching some of them die in his arms, carrying the weight of every life he couldn't save. Rob was the kind of medic who ran toward gunfire when everyone else was running away, who'd give his own blood if it meant keeping a soldier alive long enough to reach a helicopter. James admired him intensely. Rob had a calmness under fire that seemed impossible, a focus that made you believe maybe, just maybe, you might survive this hell. The ambush came without warning on a Tuesday afternoon. The platoon was moving single file through a narrow trail when automatic weapons fire erupted from 3 sides. Men dropped. Screams filled the air. James hit the ground, returning fire at muzzle flashes he could barely see through the jungle foliage. The firefight was chaos. Pure, terrifying chaos. And then James saw Rob, 50 feet ahead, running through the gunfire toward a wounded soldier who was screaming for help in the open. Rob reached the wounded man and started dragging him toward cover, but he was completely exposed. James saw the enemy soldier step out from behind a tree, saw the AK-47 raise, saw the barrel aim directly at Rob's back. James didn't think. There was no time to think. He raised his rifle and fired 3 shots. The enemy soldier dropped. Rob made it to cover with the wounded man, never knowing how close he'd come to dying. The firefight continued for another 20 minutes before the enemy melted back into the jungle, leaving the platoon to count their casualties. For dead. 7 wounded. Rob saved 3 of the wounded that day, keeping them alive until the medevac choppers arrived. That night, in the temporary base camp, one of the other soldiers told Rob what had happened. Told him that Morrison had saved his life, that an NVA soldier had him dead to rights, and the new kid had dropped him with 3 perfect shots. Rob found James sitting by himself, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands, still processing everything he'd seen that day. Rob sat down next to him without saying a word for a long minute. Then he held out his hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "I owe you my life." James shook his hand and said what every scared 19-year-old says when they don't know how to process trauma. "Just doing my job, man." But it was more than that. Over the following months, Rob and James became close. As close as you get when you're living in hell together, watching friends die, wondering if you'll see tomorrow. Rob taught James how to stay calm under fire, how to push through fear, how to focus on the man next to you instead of the terror inside you. James learned that Rob wanted to be a doctor after the war, that he was saving every penny to go to medical school, that helping people was the only thing that made sense to him anymore. They talked about what they'd do when they got home, the lives they'd build, the people they'd become. They promised each other they'd stay in touch, that they wouldn't let the war be the last chapter of their story. But war has a way of breaking promises. In month 8 of James's tour, Rob's time was up. He rotated home, back to the world, back to life. They shook hands one last time. Rob made James promise to stay alive, to come home, to look him up when the war was over. James promised. He meant it. But 3 months later, James stepped on a landmine. The explosion shredded his left leg below the knee and left him with shrapnel wounds across his body and a traumatic brain injury that would affect him for the rest of his life. He was medevaced out, spent a year in military hospitals, received a medical discharge, and came home to a country that didn't want to hear about Vietnam, didn't want to see its veterans, and certainly didn't want to deal with their broken bodies and minds. James tried. He tried. He went through physical therapy, learned to walk with a prosthetic leg. He applied for jobs, but the combination of his injury, his brain damage that made focus difficult, and the PTSD that left him with nightmares and panic attacks made holding employment nearly impossible. The VA was overwhelmed, underfunded, struggling to help hundreds of thousands of veterans just like him. James fell through the cracks. He lost touch with everyone from his unit, including Rob. He tried to find him once, early on, but Rob had moved away for medical school and James didn't know where. Before the internet, before cell phones, people could just vanish from each other's lives. And they did. James's life spiraled. He married young, but the marriage couldn't survive his trauma and instability. No family of his own, parents dead, no support system. He drifted from job to job, place to place, eventually ending up on the streets. First in Los Angeles, then Portland, finally Seattle. 3 years on that same corner, holding that same sign, watching thousands of people walk past him like he was invisible. Like he'd never been 19 years old and terrified and brave. Like he'd never saved anyone's life. Like he didn't matter. Meanwhile, Robert Chen had built the life he dreamed of. Medical school at Stanford. Residency in emergency medicine. A successful career as an ER doctor at Harbor View Medical Center in Seattle, one of the top trauma centers on the West Coast. He was married, had 2 grown daughters, owned a beautiful home overlooking Puget Sound. He'd built everything he wanted, and he'd never forgotten that he was only alive to build it because a 19-year-old kid named James Morrison had saved his life in a jungle 37 years ago. Rob had tried to find James over the years, but military records showed he'd been medically discharged, and after that, the trail went cold. Rob assumed James had built a good life somewhere, hoped he was happy, and carried the debt of gratitude quietly. Until that November morning when the ambulance brought in an unconscious homeless man with hypothermia, malnutrition, and pneumonia. The nurses were moving quickly, getting vitals, starting in 4, preparing to intubate because the man's breathing was failing. Rob walked in to assess the patient, glanced at the chart that said John Doe because he had no ID, and then looked at the man's face. And the world stopped. Rob knew that face. Older, weathered, marked by years of hardship, but unmistakable. He looked at the patient's left leg, saw the prosthetic. His hands started shaking. One of the nurses asked if he was okay. Rob couldn't speak. He moved closer, looked at the man's arm, and there it was. A faded tattoo. First Cav. The same tattoo Rob had seen dozens of times on that arm in Vietnam. This wasn't John Doe. This was James Morrison. This was the man who saved his life. And he was dying on a gurney in Rob's yard. Rob's training kicked in. He barked orders, took control of the situation with an intensity that surprised his staff. Intubate him now, get a chest x-ray, I want a full panel, warm saline 4, heated blankets, and someone find out if this man has any family. The team moved fast. James was in bad shape, his body shut down from years of neglect and exposure. But Rob wasn't going to let him die. Not after everything. Not after 37 years of owing this man his life. Rob stayed with James through the entire shift, personally overseeing his care, calling in specialists, making sure every possible intervention was tried. It took 2 days for James to wake up. When he did, groggy and confused, the first face he saw was Rob's. James didn't recognize him at first. Rob was older too, his hair gray, his face lined with decades Rob had lived because James saved him. But when Rob spoke, when he said, "James Morrison, 1st Cavalry Division, do you remember me?" something clicked in James's foggy brain. He stared at Rob, trying to place him, and then his eyes widened. Doc Chen? Rob nodded, tears streaming down his face. James. It's me. It's Rob. You saved my life in Vietnam. And now I'm going to save yours. James couldn't process it. He'd been invisible for so long, forgotten for so long, that having someone not only recognize him but remember who he'd been, what he'd done, was overwhelming. He started crying, deep sobs that shook his fragile body. Rob held his hand and waited. When James could finally speak, he said, "I'm sorry, document. I'm sorry you have to see me like this. I'm sorry I didn't do better." Rob's response was fierce. "You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing. This country failed you. The system failed you. But your value, your worth, everything you are, that never changed. You're still the man who saved my life. You're still a hero. And I'm not going to let you be invisible anymore." Rob made calls. He reached out to veteran services, to housing programs, to every resource he could think of. He called the local news. He told them the story of James Morrison, the homeless veteran who'd saved his life in Vietnam and had been living on the streets while Rob had built a successful career. The story went viral. Within days, donations poured in. A local veterans organization secured housing for James. The VA, embarrassed by the publicity, fast-tracked James's disability benefits that should have been in place decades ago. Rob personally oversaw James's medical care, treating not just the pneumonia but the chronic health issues that had been ignored for years. But Rob didn't stop there. He brought James home. While James recovered, while they found him permanent housing and got his benefits sorted, Rob invited him to stay in the guest house on his property. His wife, Patricia, welcomed James with open arms. For the first time in years, James had a home. Real food, clean clothes, medical care, and most importantly, someone who saw him. Really saw him. Not as a homeless veteran, not as a failure, but as a human being with value and dignity and a story that mattered. As James's health improved, something else happened. Rob and James started talking, really talking about Vietnam and after. About the guilt Rob carried for making it home to a good life while so many didn't. About the shame James carried for ending up on the streets. About PTSD and survivor's guilt and all the invisible wounds that war leaves behind. They helped each other heal in ways that medicine couldn't touch. Rob got James connected with other veterans, with therapy, with a support group. James, slowly, started to believe that maybe his life wasn't over. Maybe there was still time to matter, to contribute, to be seen. Today, 5 years after that November morning, James Morrison is 64 years old. He lives in a small apartment paid for by his VA benefits and supplemented by a fund Rob set up. His health is stable. He volunteers at a homeless shelter twice a week, helping other veterans get connected with services, being the person for them that Rob was for him. He speaks at schools and churches about his experience, about the invisible people on our streets, about how one moment of recognition can save a life. Rob and James have dinner together every Sunday. They're brothers now, bonded not just by war but by the years after, by the saving and being saved that went both ways. Rob says that finding James in his was the most important day of his career. That all the lives he saved as a doctor, all the good he did, it all meant more knowing that he got to pay back the debt he owed to James. But James says Rob doesn't owe him anything. He says that what Rob gave him, the recognition, the dignity, the reminder that he mattered, that was worth more than saving his life. That was saving his soul. And that's the lesson in this story. The people we walk past on the street, the homeless man on the corner, the woman sleeping in a doorway, the veteran holding a cardboard sign, they all have stories. They've all been someone. They've all mattered. Some of them are heroes who saved lives, who served their country, who once had dreams and hopes and futures. And life, circumstance, trauma, bad luck, or a system that failed them landed them on the streets. That doesn't erase who they were. It doesn't make them less human. It doesn't mean they deserve to be invisible. James Morrison saved Robert Chen's life in 1971. But he'd been dying slowly on a Seattle sidewalk for 3 years before anyone saw him. Before anyone cared enough to look past the homelessness and see the hero underneath. How many other heroes are we walking past? How many other James Morrisons are out there, invisible, forgotten, waiting for someone to recognize that they matter? We don't all have the dramatic backstory of owing our lives to someone. But we all have the power to see people, to acknowledge them, to treat them like they matter. Because they do. Every single one of them. Chen now runs a program at Harborview that connects homeless patients with veteran services and housing resources. He calls it Morrison's mission. It's helped over 300 veterans get off the streets, get medical care, and rebuild their lives. All because one doctor recognized one patient and refused to let him stay invisible. That's the power we all have. Not to save everyone, not to solve homelessness single-handedly, but to see one person. To help one person. To remind one person that they still matter. So the next time you see a homeless veteran on a street corner, don't look away. Don't pretend they're not there. You don't have to give money. You don't have to solve all their problems. But you can look them in the eye. You can acknowledge their humanity. You can say thank you for your service and mean it. Because that recognition, that moment of being seen, can be the difference between someone giving up and someone holding on long enough for their own Chen to find them. James Morrison sat on that corner for 3 years holding a sign that said please help. Thousands of people walked past. But it only took one person really seeing him to change everything. Be that one person. For someone. Anyone. Because you never know when the homeless person you're ignoring might be the hero who once saved someone's life. Might be someone who just needs to be reminded that they still matter. That their story isn't over. That they're still worth saving. That's what Rob gave James. And that's what we all have the power to give each other, if we're just willing to see.